I'd like to call this regular meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners back to order for Tuesday, June 19th, 2018. And it's our afternoon session, and our first item of business is Public Works 13A, a work session with the City of Eugene Urban Reserves Planning Project. And I believe we have Lindsay Eichner here, and will you introduce your guest from the city?
Yes, good afternoon, Chair, Commissioners. With me today, I have Terry Harding, who is
right here.
Sorry, reading my script instead of actually looking at who's here. Rebecca Gershow is here from the City of Eugene, and she'll be doing the majority of the presentation. I was going to do a short introduction. Today, we're having a work session very preliminarily about the City of Eugene's Urban Reserves project. And this project this proposal has been presented to both the city and county planning commissions as well as city council. And we've had 2 work sessions with the Lane County Planning Commission in order to clarify some follow-up questions. At this time, we really want to make it clear that there are no specific areas that are contemplated for the urban reserves. This is really the kickoff of the project. No analysis has been conducted yet. Throughout the project, county staff will be on the project management team, will be attending meetings, providing feedback, reporting back to the board and the planning commission throughout the life of the project, because it's very important for our citizens as well as the City of Eugene to work together on this cohesively. So we wanted to make sure you're aware of that. As well as we did receive some feedback from some members on our planning commission that felt it was they wanted to encourage the board to consider some of their major concerns. One of the concerns was at what point in this process should an intergovernmental agreement be discussed. Later on in the presentation, we will cover the IGAs, but we don't know what they're going to look like at this point. We don't know what exactly they're going to encompass until some further analysis happens. And so while today might not be the best day to start that discussion, we agree with the Planning Commission that the earlier the better that those discussions happen, so that we don't get all the way to the adoption phase and then start talking about IGAs and everyone's not on the same page. So we'll probably next spring we'll be coming back for another work session after analysis has been started and public outreach has been started, and that may be a good time to start talking high level about what some of those agreements between the city and county need to be made. We're not quite sure yet what those are going to look like. So, but that was definitely a concern that was raised by the Planning Commission, and a valid concern that we don't wait until it's 2 years into the project and then start talking about what's acceptable to the board and what's acceptable to City Council for those agreements. I'm going to hand it over to Rebecca to talk more about the process and the background of how we came to this process and the timelines for the overall project.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you for having me, commissioners, members of the public. My name is Rebecca Gershow. I'm a senior planner with City of Eugene. I've recently been hired to be the project manager for the Urban Reserves project, so I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about it. Emily Jerome, our deputy attorney, is here as well. We're also going to be joined by Terry Harding and Robin Hostick from the Long Range Planning Division. There may be a bit of a time snafu here, so they're getting headed down right now. They're headed down right now. So I'm just going to move us forward and talk a little bit about Terry's piece until she gets here to sit down, which is just reminding you of where we've been and how urban reserves fits within Envision Eugene.
Did you read all my notes?
I don't have your notes. I didn't
We'll
read
go
your
backwards.
notes.
I apologize. I thought we were on at 1:45.
Yeah, and Terry, if you wouldn't mind pulling the mic towards you.
Absolutely. Good afternoon, commissioners. My name is Terry Harding. I'm the manager for the city's long-range planning team. And today we're going to be talking about a project that will be implementing certain aspects of Envision Eugene, which is Eugene's community vision for managing growth and change. The Urban Reserves project was directed by our city council and encouraged directly by the board, by you all, to follow our adoption of our new urban growth boundary. And as you know, that local adoption of our UGB happened last summer and was acknowledged by the state in January of this year. So Rebecca might have already introduced herself.
I did.
So I'll skip that one. This is our community vision. It shows a summary of our community values in the 7 pillars on the left-hand side. And those serve as guiding values for all of the planning work that we do with the community. The vision map shows our new urban growth boundary with the expansion near the Eugene Airport, our downtown, our key transportation corridors, and the neighborhoods where we live, work, shop, play, and go to school. Now that the state has acknowledged our boundary and parts of a new comprehensive plan for Eugene, we're turning our attention to implementation projects like urban reserves. You might remember this graphic. It's a few years old, but we used this back in 2015 when our city council was providing direction on how to plan for the urban growth boundary and housing in particular. It shows the timing relationships between adopting what's called our baseline UGB on the graph, updating our needed housing or clear and objective standards in the next bubble, and then our growth monitoring program resulting in a monitoring report, and also the Urban Reserves project. This option or timeline was selected by our council as the fastest and most responsible way to incorporate new population estimates and the results of growth monitoring into our planning. But as you can see, there are no dates on this graphic because we did not know how long it would take to achieve UGB adoption and acknowledgement. But this graphic and the written detail accompanying it was summarized in the council memo from July 20th, 2015, which you attached in its entirety to your ordinance approving the urban growth boundary. And I believe that part of your intention with that was to ask Eugene to demonstrate our commitment to further work on the housing issue. So we've taken those general timelines and turned them into real dates now that we have achieved UGB acknowledgement. I'd like to point out a couple of things on this timeline. First, the first project out of the gate is updating those clear and objective housing standards, and that is underway with a proposal due to our council at the beginning of 2019. Meanwhile, Urban Reserves has launched, and we're in the project initiation phase with a proposal due to both our council and to you all at the beginning of 2020. And that's within 2 years of acknowledgement of our urban growth boundary. The goal of the relationship of these projects is to have an urban reserves proposal in place by the time we have our first growth monitoring report ready in 2021, 3 years after UGB acknowledgement. And that's because the growth monitoring report may show that we're growing faster than we anticipated, and we may have a need to begin our next round of UGB analysis. And in order to be prepared to grow in the best possible locations when we do have a need to grow, we believe we need to have urban reserves in place. And with that, I'd like to hand it to Rebecca to explain our approach for handling urban reserves.
Thanks, Terry. I think I'm going to skip over this piece and just jump right into it. So urban reserves are important now for a number of reasons. As you know, as the community's been talking about, housing supply and affordability is already a critically important issue for our community. As Terry mentioned, we're coordinating our urban reserves planning work with the work of our growth monitoring program so that urban reserves are in place before the UGB is re-examined in January 2021. This is important because without urban reserves in place, future UGB expansions for housing would likely be limited by state law to exception areas and non-resource land. Shown here on this map from our UGB expansion analysis in Rust. We're using this just as a demonstration because we don't have a study area yet for urban reserves. This just gives you an idea of where the exception areas and non-resource lands are. They include the airport, LCC, and rural residential lands scattered around the city. The problem is many of these areas are already developed to some degree and have a low likelihood of redevelopment if they're brought into the UGB. You may remember from the UGB process that our study showed most of these lands are extremely expensive to serve and may not meet our community's needs. This is a key point because if we don't have urban reserves in place when there is a need to expand our UGB, then our choices will be limited to these areas. Urban reserves will give us additional options for smart growth and for meeting the goals of Envision Eugene if and when there is a need to expand. So here's another way of looking at it. We've created a very simplified diagram over the next few slides. We did this because we've gotten a number of questions in the realm of why are we doing this additional work of urban reserves when we know that in the future we're going to need to expand our urban growth boundary for housing. Why don't we just start doing that? Why are we doing this urban reserves work? So we're trying to show these diagrams to sort of make it a little bit more universal. So let's say we have this city here in dark blue. It's got its urban growth boundary around it, supplying enough land for 20 years of growth. Let's say this city grows and its leaders determine the UGB needs to be expanded as one way to meet the needs of its growing population. So this is how cities usually do it. The state has set up a ranking system for analyzing land suitable for urbanization. As we just discussed, exception areas and non-resource land are first priority. Urban reserves are also first priority. But if a city and county don't already have urban reserves in place, they are limited to using these other first priority lands. These are examples of like the rust-colored areas we looked at on the previous map. We just discussed many of the potential problems with limiting ourselves to these lands, including they're often inefficient and expensive to serve and develop. They often have limited access to transit and other services. They're scattered around the edges of the community and non-contiguous, and they have low future development potential because many are already fully or partially developed. So cities could go this route instead, the route of identifying urban reserves, which will set aside enough land for 10 to 30 years of additional growth beyond the urban growth boundary. Because the urban reserve timeframe is so much greater than with a UGB expansion, more land is needed. So cities may consider including not just first priority, but also lower priority lands as part of their urban reserves. With a larger contiguous area of land making up these potential urban reserves, there are more opportunities for cost savings and efficiencies when planning for transit, roads, and other services to serve our future neighborhoods. Then, as you can see here, once urban reserves are designated by the city and the county, they automatically become first priority land when it's time for cities to analyze where to expand their urban growth boundary. The final step is bringing urban reserves into the UGB when the time is right. Urban reserve land is further analyzed and planned based on cities' expansion needs, then brought into the UGB for specific uses such as housing and jobs. So here are just a few additional points. Our planning horizon for urban reserves is 2032 to 2062. Per state law, we can look at 30 years beyond our urban growth boundary, which was from 2012 to 2032. We already talked about the benefits of cost-effective provision of facilities and services, the development of of service provider intergovernmental agreements, and the fact that urban reserve land will remain rural and can't be urbanized unless it's brought into a city's UGB through the formal state-directed process for expansion, and I'll talk about that more in a couple minutes. So here's another way of looking at the issue. This graph shows our urban reserves planning horizon, like I said, 2032 to 2062. It shows how Eugene is projected to be growing during that time. Using the most recent population forecasts, which were updated in 2015, this shows a 2062 population for Eugene of almost 270,000 people, which is an additional 84,000 people added to our community between 2015 and 2062. This is roughly equivalent to the size of the city of Medford. So here's another way of looking at it. This we are calling our policy dial. As we've discussed, the state requires urban reserves to include no less than 10 and no more than 30 additional years of land beyond the supply included in the UGB. So this big dial is supposed to represent the amount of growth projected during that time. It highlights what will be our big policy choice in the urban reserves discussion. Determining the time frame will be a key policy piece, whether we set aside enough land for 10 years of growth, 30 years of growth, or somewhere in between. It will affect both the size and location of our urban reserves, and it's a key decision point that we will be coming back to the Board of Commissioners for. So how are we going to do this? Well, this is truly a collaborative effort. We can't succeed without the partnership of, first and foremost, the county. We've already been working very closely with county staff as members of our project management team. We've been very lucky to have Lindsay and Kier both involved with us. It also includes the active participation of a wide variety of other people and agencies, including the broad community, property owners, stakeholder groups, leaders and staff in other capacities from Eugene and Lane County, our nearby cities, and a wide variety of utility and service providers who will be responsible for providing those services in the urban reserves area. Those service providers include folks responsible for sewer, water, fire protection, parks, transportation, and stormwater. Excuse me. From a technical standpoint, the project charter we have included in your packet outlines the project timeline and the major deliverables. It also includes sideboards or assumptions that are going to be essential for us to deliver the project on time. Two of the key assumptions we want to highlight are that the urban reserves project will carry forward the same development density and housing mix assumptions we used in our UGB analysis. These assumptions will be revisited when our first growth monitoring report is complete in 2021, when we have additional data to use. Also, as directed by our council in 2015, We will use the most current population forecast, which, as I mentioned, is the 2015 PSU forecast for Eugene and Lane County. A new forecast is expected next year. It will probably be finalized in about a year from now, and those projections will be used in our growth monitoring reports and in any future UGB expansion analysis. So here is our outreach process timeline. I also included a 11 by 17 version in front of you because it's hard to read smaller than that. So as you can see, the project's major phases are shown in the middle, with the project's committees, commissions, council, and Board of Commissioners meetings shown along the bottom, and public engagement opportunities shown along the top. It has a variety of different ways for the public to weigh in, including large open houses, smaller area-specific meetings, and interactive online engagement for those not interested or able to participate in person. It also includes ways we'll engage community groups, service providers, public agencies, and boards and commissions at our key decision points throughout the process. So we're currently in phase 1, project initiation. Beginning in phase 2, technical analysis, and through option development, which is phase 3 there, we will be updating our land supply projections, developing a study area, analyzing land suitable for inclusion in an urban reserve, including constraints and land capacity, and determining the preferred planning period, location, and size of an urban reserve. This is a technical, multi-step, iterative approach which will include significant public engagement. We will then be bringing a proposal to the City Council and the Board of Commissioners by January 2020, which we've highlighted in red there. If directed by the Council and the Board of Commissioners to begin the formal adoption process, we will then prepare a complete adoption package and schedule the first formal public hearing by fall of 2020. Which we've shown here in the formal adoption process, which is the last phase. The last phase includes a number of work items, including the final development of intergovernmental agreements. We can't begin formalizing those agreements until we know what areas will be included in the urban reserves, but we will start to work on more general agreement points and cost estimates on service provision earlier in the technical analysis phase. So we won't be waiting on that, but we will have a lot of work on making those general agreement points more specific once we have an urban reserve proposal in place. Also included, importantly, in that phase are Metro Plan and Comprehensive Plan amendments, including a Metro Plan boundary review. We will hold formal public hearings, and then adoption consideration is targeted, as I said, in the fall by the City Council and Board of Commissioners. So one of the key project work items I keep mentioning is the development of these intergovernmental agreements between the city, county, and our special districts that will serve the urban reserve area. This is because state law requires that each jurisdiction adopts these agreements at or before designation of urban reserves. State law also requires that urban reserve land will remain rural until it is added to the UGB. Plan policies and code can be developed to ensure that development and land division won't hinder the efficient transition to urban uses and services. Determining, as Lindsay was mentioning, determining what level of regulation we want to place on urban reserve land will be a key work item for the city and county as we begin our technical analysis. So what about rural reserves? Folks have suggested that at the same time urban reserves are designated, we should also consider identifying rural reserves to provide long-term protection for our high-value agricultural, forest, or natural resource land. However, currently, state law only allows rural reserves in the Portland metro area. We don't actually have authority to designate rural reserves in Lane County. Some have suggested that while rural reserves has a very specific definition in state law that we can't currently meet, we will achieve virtually the same thing by designating potentially urbanizable areas as urban reserves, since the areas outside of them should, by default, remain rural. So the decision-making process includes both internal and external communication, and I'm just going to highlight two of these committees that we are proposing that will be critical to the success of this project. The first is our service provider working group that will be developed to collaborate on service provision in the urban reserve area, help develop IGAs, and act as liaisons to their agency leadership. This group will be meeting throughout the planning process, as you can see in the outreach process graphic. There's a preliminary list of service providers included in the back of your public involvement plan, if you're interested in seeing the list that we have so far, which is evolving. The second group is the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee. Our recently adopted comprehensive plan included the creation of the ETAC, which will advise staff on citywide growth management initiatives, including urban reserve planning and growth monitoring. It will also review project assumptions and our technical analysis. They'll report to staff, and members will be appointed by the city manager. Recruitment is beginning this month. It actually just began this week, as the application is now posted on our project website. ETAC members will represent varied voices from across the community with diverse interests and areas of expertise. So finally, the Board of Commissioners role. Well, we will be coming to you regularly either in front of you or via email with updates and input at key milestones throughout the process. You will be providing direction on a proposed urban reserve option by January of 2020, and you will be convening public hearings, considering the Planning Commission recommendations, and acting to adopt by ordinance the urban reserve proposal by fall of 2020. So next steps, we have, as Lindsay noted, we've already been to the Eugene Planning Commission, the County Planning Commission twice, the Eugene City Council, and here we are with you today. Next week, we are going back to the Eugene Planning Commission for them to act to approve our public involvement plan. At the same time, we're moving ahead on the beginning of our Phase 2 work, which includes recruiting our ETAC members, beginning work with our consultant to work on our land demand analysis, establishing our preliminary study area. Once that is established, we're scheduled to have our first large public meeting in the early fall. And I welcome any questions and comments. Thank you for your time.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you. I'll also put my hand up for the second round, but this will be brief. I'm really encouraged by this. It really is exciting to move forward with urban reserves. We've been talking about it for quite some time. I have a couple of questions, but first, a couple of quotes from Emily Jerome. This is going to be one heck of an ordinance, end quote. That was, let's see, October 14th, 2010, you said that. And George Polling said, that same date, said, if we can't set up a deadline and stick to it, what is the community going to think of us? Well, we've had deadlines come and go, but it seems that we have some fairly firm deadlines here on the timeline that you're presenting regarding the deadline for actually employing urban reserves. And to me, that is an encouraging thing, because I'm not I think a lot about this. But I carry it around with me, housing. And really, we have a dearth. There's no doubt about it. We had our strategic planning meeting for our health department was last week. And everybody was asked to put their main concerns regarding the health of Lane County. The main concern, 5-to-1, was housing. 5-to-1. And this is from the health department, health officials. So it's clear that we have an urgency here. And we don't need to hackney that. We don't need to banty that around. We have an urgency to get more housing in place. And I'm encouraged. I'm really pleased to see this moving forward. I'm pleased to see the people sitting in the audience. Robin, it's great to see you involved in this. And Emily, you and I have been talking about this for a long, long, long time. So John Reese and I had a lengthy meeting in my office, and I still have on my whiteboard the timeline that he and I came up with that day and signed our names to it. Now that's not a binding contract, is it? But it really reflects kind of what you're showing right here as far as the timeline is concerned. You're outlining a pretty vigorous process, and one that is relying on some potentially questionable data. That is to say, what is our population growth? You know, we have a certain expectation of it, and if we keep our boundaries constrained, well, we're not going to have as much population growth. If we don't allow people to grow here, Junction City is going to have the growth, and Cottage Grove, as has been demonstrated, will have the growth, and other places around us will grow into us. So in the meantime, it's important for us to make certain that we here in the metropolitan area of Eugene and Springfield, which is where the growth really should happen, because this is where the bulk of the jobs are, make sure that we are diligently and honestly, forthrightly going forward with the process with deadlines in place, that at the end of the day, we don't set up a deadline and stick to it if we don't not set up a deadline and stick to it. So, you know, I got involved in the Envision Eugene process back in 2010. Probably a little bit before that is when we got started. And we had a lot of setbacks along the way and a lot of changes to the process along the way. No need to discuss that. We're at a point in time right now where we don't have much leeway. We have people who are losing their houses as we sit here. Literally as we sit here, people who live in houses today who next week will not have a place to live simply because they're not able to afford the housing in our local area. So we need to be innovative about putting new housing in place. And it's not just expanding the urban growth boundary by any stretch of the imagination. In Eugene, you're taking hard looks at what DLCD is recommending for ADUs. I think you're calling them ADUs now too, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, so we need to move forward on a very broad front to make sure that people are going to have places to live. And a large part of it is making certain that when it is time to expand the urban growth boundary, that we do have reserves in place that make it much easier, already predetermined how it's going to happen, where it's going to happen. So we don't get into a bogged down process. We don't get bogged down by public process the way we did. And we all have to admit that we got bogged down by public process on Envision Eugene over and over again. We got bogged down by lengthy public process, and I'm not faulting that out loud, but you know, that is the case. And once we get the urban reserves in place, it encourages me that we can move forward more rapidly in making sure we have more front doors. So you know, if you ask people with kids who are in high school, getting ready to graduate, where are your kids going to live? You know, Terry, where are your kids going to live?
My ADU.
Right on. It doesn't have to match your house either, and you don't have to have off-street parking. Okay, we can get into more details. But seriously, that really, it's not just people moving here. When the University of Oregon adds its wonderful new night center, how many high-paying jobs, middle-paying jobs are they going to attract into our community? There's going to be a lot of jobs. Those people are going to want to come here, and they're going to be buying houses that match their salaries. And in doing that, they're going to be putting people out of housing who already have housing here, or moving people down the ladder of housing because the price of housing will go up accordingly. Now, all statistics show us that Lane County is not the highest priced housing in Oregon. I think Tillamook County is outside of the Tri-County metropolitan area. But that being said, if you compare it with our wages, the people who are currently living here are going to get kind of bumped down that scale as more people move in to take the jobs that we know are on the horizon. So it makes it more critical that we stick to a schedule on this, and significantly make certain that the people who grow up here, who live here, who currently live here, can stay here and don't get forced out of housing, or don't get forced to do what's happening in Portland, where people who work downtown Portland have to live in Gresham and beyond to be able to afford a home to work downtown Portland. And we want to avoid that as much as possible. So I said this, let's see, one last word is bravo, John Reese. This is back in 2010 for the process that we're going through starting in 2010. Well, bravo for moving forward apace with this. Bravo for bringing it to us. And I'm looking forward to the process. It's going to be exciting. And I think we have good people on the job. So bravo. Thank you.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you very much. So because of the state law, you're saying that we're prohibited from doing rural reserves? Prohibited? Like, does it say, we don't want any county to do rural reserves? It's only a good idea for some areas. Sorry, you're not it.
We're just not enabled. Is that
So there's no enabling legislation that says
correct?
the following counties can, have rural reserves.
Emily might speak to this, but I believe it doesn't say we can't, but it doesn't say we can. It says the areas that
Okay.
can is Portland
All right.
Metro.
Do you want to tackle that, either of you, lawyers? Sounds like we don't have explicit authorization to do it, and the question is, are we prohibited from doing it?
Yeah, I happen to know you have a law degree, sir, so I'm going to tell you what the statute is. I haven't looked at it in quite a while. The statute that addresses urban reserves also addresses rural reserves. It says very little. Most of what we have is in OARs. But rural reserves, let's see. A county and a metropolitan service district, metro, established under ORS Chapter 268, Metro, may enter into an IGA to designate urban reserves. So it authorizes Metro. It speaks nothing to other areas, and so there are no provisions here for rural reserves. It is not my place by far to tell you you can't just go ahead and try it, maybe through Home Rule Authority. That would be a conversation with your own council. I will tell you a little bit more, which is that in Metro, not only are they enabled because of all the communities and the fact that their boundaries are so close together and their planning impacts one another, they actually are required to establish rural reserves when they establish urban reserves. So they're actually saying, future urbanizable land, not future urbanizable.
Yeah. Now this may be for the rest of you, but will the technical analysis that gets to establishing the proposed urban reserves at the kind of toward the end of this process, will they be working on rural reserves during the first year of summer 18, spring 19?
No.
No.
Not at this time, the technical analysis will be focused on urban reserves.
So if somebody comes after your technical analysis is done in the options phase, and they say, well, gosh, this guy at the end of the table was saying we should probably think about rural reserves, then we're going to have to go back to square one to do the rural reserves before we move on, if that comes, if that happens.
There's no reason why we couldn't designate urban reserves and then afterwards go through whatever needs to happen to be enabled to designate rural reserves if the city and county choose to do that, and then move forward with that as a separate project.
Well, I guess this will just be my perspective, is that by establishing the idea that you're not going to do rural reserves, or if you do them, you'll do them later, you're kind of saying to the community, hey, we know all these goals under Oregon land use law are really important, and we know protection of farmland is really important, so that's why we want to do these urban reserves first, and we'll do the rural reserves later. Okay, now, consider this dynamic. We think all these goals, housing, rural, agriculture, forestry, transportation, coastal, we think all these goals are really important. Every single one of them. Housing, very important. Forestry, very important. Agriculture, very important. That's why we're going to do both. Okay? So I'm just letting you know that, and this is just one commissioner's perspective, and obviously you have to deal with all the Eugene city officials, mayor and councilors, and all 5 commissioners in a sort of a hodgepodge of checks and balances in our form of government. But I'm just giving you the perspective that some people want to have both. They want to have both the protection of rural areas and urban services. By focusing on one, there's the potential that some people will feel you're neglecting. I say you in a sort of a generic, all planners, all lawyers, all government officials, all elected officials. You are ignoring that important part of the equation. And so just be aware that after your technical analysis is done, a year from now, somebody else is going to ask this question.
Sure, that's good information. Also, while we're not going to be focusing on designating rural reserves, we are going to have a lot of technical information on where our high-value farmland is, on where our high-value natural resources and forest land are. So we will have good updated inventory information in that study area for those lands that we don't want to urbanize and by default do want to protect, because ultimately those will be areas that will not be selected into our urban reserves. So this is a good heads up from you, and maybe part of it is how we talk about it as well, because I do believe that by designating urban reserves, we will in part be seeing those areas that we do not want to develop as a regional community.
De facto.
I appreciate the comment too, and think we can probably research what tools might be available to us to get at those values. And I also want to let you know this has absolutely been a part of our council's conversation, and they also deeply care about protecting the best ag land through this process. One councilor in particular, but I think it's a value of the community at large.
Thank you.
Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm just trying to get my arms around the timeline and the county commissioner's role. So the proposed urban reserves, so you're going through the project initiation, technical analysis, develop options. So you're looking at potentially January 2020 before it comes back to the board for actual adoption. Is that correct?
For a proposal,
Yeah.
recommendation,
Recommendation.
direction.
Yeah, excuse me. Recommendation, and then it has to go to DLCD for the final approval and be voted on by LCDC. Is that correct?
So final hearings and a decision would be in fall 2020. Right, and then it needs to be acknowledged by the state. That's correct.
Actual adoptions out
Yeah.
Out
So,
in fall of 2020.
so January of 2020, the goal is to bring it to the city council and the board to say, should we start the public hearing process before the planning commissions, and then go to the city council and the board? So that's that red
Yeah.
January 2020.
I see it right there.
Yeah.
So when you talk to your colleagues around the state, let's say if this process were being done in Redmond, would the timeline be very similar?
Redmond is one of the few cities who has done urban reserves. There are few out there. I don't know what their timeline is, honestly, but this is looking at our best guess locally based on how we know our community engagement works and the amount that we need to do technical analysis and cross our Ts and dot our Is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because invariably, in our wonderful community here, you're going to get appealed. I mean, this, you just might as well just chalk it up and figure out how long that'll be before the final adoption actually is. And who knows? And I'm guessing you may have that built in your timeline. Is that correct?
We assume with the UGB adoption, there was about 6 months,
Yeah.
including an appeal between.
And that's why you're going out to the potentially winter, fall of 2020 for final adoption, building in the appeal process into that.
Well, the appeal process would happen after local adoption action is taken, late 2020.
Thank you very much. And that's all I know. Jay was whispering. Oh, I knew what I was asking. So don't. No, I'm just trying to get, and the reason why I bring this up, I mean, Commissioner Farr has mentioned housing on several occasions, and you know what, in housing is becoming critical, and if you look at some of the areas from an economic standpoint where we're trying to, you know, with quote unquote the Silicon Shire, and the thing that's happening here, if we want to truly attract opportunity, we're going to have housing. Because I will tell you who's being extremely aggressive in this is Boise, Idaho, Provo, Utah, Henderson, Nevada, you name them, all here on the West Coast that are being very aggressive on this issue, very aggressive by attracting these different companies, and they're really working to make sure that they have this housing issue in place to accommodate. And the last thing I think we need is to see these opportunities that are beginning to happen here, we get left behind. And, you know, businesses make decisions based on all sorts of efforts, obviously, and housing being such a critical need. The other, and we've talked a lot about what's going on here at the U of O and Oregon State, which thank God, I'm glad the University of Oregon is doing this, because if you look at the enrollment discrepancies right now between Oregon State and University of Oregon, it's almost 10,000. With Oregon State, almost 10,000 students more than U of O. I mean, that is significant. And you know, if I were Oregon, I'd be betting the farm as well with the Night Science campus. Frankly, that's, I think, what they're doing, and I think it's a great idea. And because of the potential startups that'll come out of that are going to be significant, but we need the housing. And so I appreciate the work you're doing, the efforts. I'm just trying to get my arms around the timeline and where, in particular, where Eugene will be in a positive position. So thank you.
So first, I want to just state that my support for the urban reserve process, in fact, if it was up to me and I was czar for a day in Oregon, every city would have to go through urban reserves, and it would be for the full 50-year time span. Because as an engineer that's had to do urban planning, particularly for infrastructure, not knowing what direction you're growing in is really difficult. And a 20-year window for infrastructure planning is not a long enough window. You know, when you start thinking about things like pump stations, reservoirs, sewer pump stations, sewage treatment plants, locations, you know, transportation infrastructure, water rights, you know, all that stuff requires a long-term horizon, and 20 years for UGB is not a long horizon, especially once you adopt it, your actual data is already multiple years old as a 2009 population, you know, projections that were utilized in what was finally finalized in 2018. So, you know, so I really support this effort because I think it's really important for not just the issues of getting housing supply, which is critical, which is I'm going to speak to in a minute, but as an engineer that's had to plan urban infrastructure, and I don't care whether it's a small city or it's Eugene or it's a major metropolitan area, you have to look pretty far out and be making some long-term plans and have those wrapped into, you know, master plans and then on down to a 5-year capital plan, and what you're actually building this year is all about thinking that you know, what are you going to need in 50 years? And if you're not thinking that way, you're going to get caught short sometime in the future. So this is a really vital and crucial process. And it's great that we don't have to only look at exception lands. And that kind of speaks a little bit to this whole idea of rural reserves. The reason they're called exception lands in Oregon is anything that's not a resource land, either forest or ag, is an exception if it's outside of a UGB or outside city limits. And the reason it's an exception was it just happened to be there when we adopted our statewide land use laws. Everything else is supposed to stay rural. You don't need to adopt a rural reserve. It's in there in our code and in our statewide planning goals. There's over 4,000 square miles of land in Lane County. Eugene occupies 40 square miles. It's less than 100th. So even if you're talking about our growth over the next 50 years, is not going to have an impact on our ability to maintain rural lands. We will look at, I'm sure you'll have this information available to the advisory committees and all that, where are class 1 soils? Where are class 2 soils? Where's their irrigation available, the high value ag soils? I can tell you just from my knowledge and the farmers I work with in my district, we're not going to be able to jump across the Willamette River or the McKenzie and head towards Coburg with this urban growth boundary, because that's where our high value soils are. We're not going to be able to go right up the Willamette River just on the west side, because some of those river bottom lands are our high value soils. So you kind of basically River Road East, it's probably going to be out. Where we're going to be looking probably is to the north and west, where the soils start getting heavier clay, higher water tables, and you're seeing ryegrass and sheep. That's because you can't grow anything else. And that'll become obvious, I'm sure, in the technical group. And you guys will make some of those decisions based on that. What I'm really concerned about is some of the timelines. 2007, the legislature passed a bill that said, Eugene, Springfield, you guys have to adopt separate urban growth boundaries. 2009, Eugene finally sort of starts on the process. They take up the 2009 population updates. Somewhere about 2015, we finally get the hybrid option offered. And in that offer was this idea that things were going to happen on certain timelines. I guess I should have looked at the fine print, that the targets were for just consideration, not completion. Everybody involved in the process thought that this line here was what was going to happen in January, not the red. And all along, since 2015 to January of 2018, while we're going through the Envision Eugene process, we all thought this process was underway. So I am highly disappointed in the timeline we've been given, and that it should really be ending in 2020 with local adoption in January 2020. So whatever can be done to speed up that timeline, and that speaks to your public involvement process, is going to have to be sped up too. That's what I'm looking for. Because this is something that's so past due for this area. And something, as we talk about, looking at the next population projections and all that stuff, needed housing codes and all that, I can tell you what we adopted in Envision Eugene is so far off of reality, it's crazy. We did not adopt 20-year supply of land when we chose not to expand the urban growth boundary. I mean, I can go and pick apart almost all of what you guys show as inventory in the South Hills as practically undevelopable, and particularly by any sort of objective housing standards, which you guys don't have really in the South Hills. So all those things combined in my mind, we are sitting right now on a UGB that does not give us our housing supply. We had a presentation by Brian Rooney last week he's a regional economist for the State Employment Department, talking about where our economy is going. Well, Oregon's economy is leveling off. You know why? Workforce. You know why? Housing. We have a critical housing shortage, and particularly in Lane County. And this kind of timeline extension and what seems like kind of dithering from where I sit, we need to move. This needs a sense of urgency, and getting to it. And I bet once we finish up the objective standards for housing, we're going to go back and look at that inventory, and it's going to be shot to hell. Although you guys don't have it in your plan to go back and look at that inventory until somewhere in 2021. You know, with the next set of population projections after we've adopted this urban reserve. Although the fact that we're going out, I would push hard, and if we don't go there, I'll scream bloody murder, push hard for the full 50 years, because at least that will outweigh some of the issues about which population projection we adopt and what you're counting on existing inventory, because it washes when you go that far out. You know, that will make up for some of the mistakes or assumption errors. But we really, you know, for me, it's got to be for the full 50 years, and whatever we can do to shorten this timeline, because we need to get to a point where we can make the next adjustment in Eugene's UGB. One of the things that was in Brian Rooney's presentation was a table. And it was a table basically talking about where the population growth has happened from 2016 July 1st to 2017 July 1st, over a single year. Do you know where the most population change and the greatest percent population change actually happened in Lane County? Used to be Junction City had the highest percent, but of course they're only 5,000 people, so that's not a lot of people. You know who outgrew the city of Eugene? Unincorporated Lane County. 2% population growth and 2,000 in population added in a single year. If you want to have rural reserves, fix the urban reserve problem. Because right now we are pushing our population growth into unincorporated Lane County. That's got to change. So everybody wants to talk about compact urban development and the need for that, everything that goes with it, which I agree with. It's one of the reasons I moved to this state. I came from a state that did not have statewide planning. You know, and I was in land development. You know, I chose this state for some very specific reasons. All that goes, you know, delay is good as not planning. So this timeline from 2007 to 2018, and now we're talking about 2021, basically by the time we get urban reserves and start making adjustments to our urban growth boundary, that's just as good as not planning. What it does is it's going to drive that growth in that unincorporated area. People are going to be looking for every rule exception they can to get a dwelling unit because we just need housing. We can't get around the fact that our population's growing, our technology is making people live longer. I mean, if we don't, you know, if there's not some outbreak of some weird exotic, disease that decimates our population, we're going to continue to see population growth. It's just a given. So if we're not planning for it, moving fast to plan for it, then we're just not planning. So my comments are, go back, look at your 2015 memo, and instead of talking about presenting options at that time, talk about seeing how you can get to local decision complete and start appeal period. Commissioner Sorens.
Thank you so much. I just want to ask a question about population projections. Portland State University has a center that does these population projections, and Commissioner Bozovich just mentioned the use of them recently in our presentation by Mr. Rooney, the regional economist. And I just want to get the basic picture. Each December, Portland State analyzes the data that they collected as of July 1st and issues a population report backdated to July 1st. And then they compare that to their previous July 1st estimate, giving a percentage growth or loss number for the whole county. Is that your understanding, how that Portland State population works?
Except we don't get it annually.
Well, that's the estimates, not the projections. That's the
Okay,
estimates.
these are just the estimates.
Right.
Okay, and so my next question is about the projections. When do they issue their projections?
So they issued their first new projection in 2015 and established a review cycle of every 3 years. Okay. Before we got ours in 2018, they switched which group of counties we were in.
Oh,
So
okay.
that delayed us to 2019.
Okay. So in 2019, as of July 1st, we'll get that by December of 2019?
It's July 1, 2019.
Well, that's the date of the projection, but they take a while to give that, to make that analysis, don't they?
They're probably already in the process of making the projections, and they'll come out with draft ones in the spring and certify them by the end of the fiscal year, June 30th.
Oh, okay. So do their annual population estimates coincide with their 3-year population projections?
I
July
assume
1st?
they're wrapped into it, but I'd have to get back to you
Okay.
on how that works.
Do you know what our current population projection is for the city of Eugene? Like, do we have the one you put up there, was that?
That's the current.
That's the one from 2015.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the last projection.
And so we're going to get a better one, or at least a newer one, maybe not better, but newer, 2019. Is that correct? 4 years after the 2015.
That's correct.
Okay. So is there been any thought in the planning world, big planning world, at the beginning of some big project like this, like how many people do we really want to accommodate? We want to accommodate all of them, accommodate most of them. We want to have more births, fewer in-migrants, more births, fewer in-migrants, more births and more in-migrants, or fewer births and no in-migrants. Is there any concern about that, or is that outside of the scope of what planners can do? Like, because I'm not sure everybody would agree we need more people in Lane County.
Totally. I mean, it's been a big conversation topic since the beginning of Envision Eugene, but we are required to use the Portland State estimates and forecasts in our planning. So that's what we're handed, and then how we manage that growth is, to a certain degree,
And
up to
for
local
people that think, wow, why aren't we doing something about this population growth? Why don't we have fewer people rather than more people? You have to say, we're going to go by the rules. The rules don't encompass that kind of thinking. The rules envision that we're going to call up Portland State and find out how many more people there is going to be, not question them, more or less, and plan for those people. So if the growth rate is 10%, we'll accommodate those people. If the growth rate's 2%, we'll accommodate those people. If the growth rate's 50%, somehow we'll accommodate those people. Is that a fair summary? Or where do policymakers get to say, wait a minute, enough's enough?
Right, that's
We really don't want to be San Jose. San Jose is great. If you like San Jose, go to San Jose. They've already ruined their county.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think part of the decision makers' ability to create policy is in how we want to set the urban reserves. So we can plan for fewer people or for more people within this, assuming we've agreed to do urban reserves. We can say we're going to plan for 16,000 new folks from the end of our urban growth boundary period, or we can plan for almost 50,000 new folks. So let's decide what we are comfortable with. Where are we comfortable setting aside, and how much land we're comfortable setting aside. And I think
What if we wanted more than that? What if we aspired to be greater than San Jose, and we wanted 149,000 people? Could we plan for that too?
not according
No, because we have to go
state
by
law.
the Portland State estimates?
We have to go by state law for urban reserves, which says we can plan for up to 30 years out from the end of our urban growth boundary period, which this is the current population estimate.
2015 is the current population forecast.
Using the 2015 population forecast, so it says that we should use the most recent population forecast, and it also says that we can plan for 10 to 30 years. Emily, do you want to jump in?
So it's purely a legal question in terms of what this project requires. We have to use PSU's estimates. As you recall, we used to have to use your estimates, and the cities would come to you, some of them saying, I really think we're going to grow more, and someone would say, I really think we're going to grow less. Nobody has that sort of responsibility to deal with those kinds of requests anymore. It was statutory change a few years back. We all use PSU's numbers, and we all must accommodate the number of people they say are coming. If you don't like that approach, if you think that maybe some cities should be sort of tapped out because they're surrounded by high-value farmland, for example, and ridgelines maybe, if you feel that as a policy matter, that's an appropriate position for a city or county to take, your conversations with the legislature.
Yeah, because we're going to use the Portland State numbers, and we're going to plan for 20 years of growth, period, end of story for any city or county in the state. But the one piece of flexibility is on the 10, 20, or 30.
Which is hardly flexibility in terms of the issue that you've raised, because it's a period of time. So if you really only want to prepare for X number of people, that'll dictate how long you're planning, because it's those PSU numbers no matter what that time period is.
What if we want to plan for more people?
You cannot.
do that.
And that goes
Cannot.
back to we can't overreach. There has to be a basis for taking in what is likely going to be some lower priority land.
And what about building up as opposed to out?
It's encouraged. It's very much
encouraged, but it still doesn't change the reality that if your entire town is surrounded by high-value farmland, you're still going to expand onto high-value farmland to stay
You
with.
expand, or you go real tall. But yes, you must find places to put all those bodies.
Yeah, okay. But you could accommodate that growth and not expand your urban growth boundary by
Density.
density.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Farr, you asked to be in the second round, and I forgot, so.
That's okay, thanks. And not much here. Just once again, I commend your work because you have this juggling act. You have people like me who say we need more houses, and then you get another opinion that may say, what if some people in Lane County don't want more people in Lane County? You know, you've got that juggling act, and in fact, currently, we didn't expand the urban growth boundary for residential. We didn't do it. And we have people on River Road complaining that we're putting in R2, where they really wish R1 was going in. Well, it's R2. Sorry, guys. That's what we have. I'm looking at the numbers. The R2, R1 mix in the city of Eugene, and a conscious decision was made to adjust that mix. I think it was 55 to 45. Is that correct?
Single family and multifamily.
Yeah,
Right.
Which is a pretty significant shift, which adds lots and lots more apartments, lots and lots more parking concerns, lots more traffic congestion concerns, and quite often the people who complain about all of those latter things are the ones who said we don't want to expand the urban growth boundary. So it's that juggling act, and I apologize, because, Terry, sometimes I'm pretty critical. You ever notice that? Well, I am. Not out loud very often, but the fact is, I'm striving to get more front doors, and it's not for the people who are moving here. It's for the people who are growing here, who are living here, who are working here. And if we don't want more people in Lane County, we'd better quit having families then. Let's just pass a rule that let's pass it the single-person household, multi-person household. Let's change that balance, but we can't do that. And, it's going to happen. We are an area of growth. We have to accommodate it. The only thing, and I'm looking at Randy Athletic in the back right now, the only thing that I am concerned about is something that Randy and I have shared a number of times. That's when you're doing population projections, the further out you go, the less reliable they potentially are going to be. And we've seen that even when you go 2 years out, you can't hit it right on the nose. And, with the urban growth, with the urban reserves, we're looking at projecting out to 2062, 30 years beyond the end of the current, the current urban growth boundary limits. So we have to bear that in mind and know that that's going to change. And if Councillor Zelenka's correct, and he's pretty sure he is, that we're going to have some pretty significant climate refugees. People wanted to come here because there's no more water in the Valley of the Sun, and because Houston just got too darn hot, and by golly, Lane County looks pretty comfortable, then, we have to accommodate that as it goes along. So a part of the process is looking at it all the time, keeping an eye on it, and making certain that something doesn't sneak up on us, which is what you guys do. It's what you guys are very, very good at, I believe. So I have confidence and that we're going to move forward with this. I have confidence that we're going to find a way to add more houses through housing types, through infill, through going up, through going out, and it's going to happen because everybody's attention is being paid to it right now. And so I think last thing I'm going to say is you've heard conversations on a pretty broad spectrum of issues from the Board of County Commissioners, and expect those to go along. But in the meantime, let's just keep the eye on the ball of making certain that people can live here, making certain that we can accommodate places for people to live into the future. Because right now, my children, the next generation, are finding it difficult to find a place to live in Eugene. And soon, the next generation, their children, are going to find it even more difficult to find a place to live in Eugene. And we all want our families to stay with us. So whatever we want to say about people moving here from other places, they're going to do it for climate concerns, they're going to do it for job concerns, and they're going to do it because they were born here and they want to stay here. So I juggle all that and come up with a perfect plan. And can you have that by next Thursday? So thanks for the presentation. Thanks for the work you're putting into it, and I look forward to working together to making things happen.
Could I have
Commissioner Light?
Oh,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Terry, if you need
Well, I wanted to just respond to some of the things that were just said and assure you that we are all feeling the housing crunch as well. We've hired 7 new planners in the last year, and all of them are experiencing the housing difficulties that you've mentioned. But the good side of that is that they're all working on these projects. We're working very hard to update our growth monitoring information and get to those solutions and adoption as quickly as possible. I just wanted to say that so that you know that we're genuinely interested in advancing these solutions as quickly
Did
as
they all move here to take the job?
Rebecca did.
Yeah, okay. There you
Yeah.
go, Commissioner Sorensen.
Several of them did.
Commissioner Lyken.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I actually wasn't going to really comment anymore, but being as we've gotten this whole population conversation, because this is something that I've been spending quite a bit of time with, just taking a look at where Lane County was and where Lane County is. Think about this for a moment. So in 1970, if you index for inflation, Lane County's median income was about $60,000 a year. Today it's $51,000. In 1980, Lane County was the second most populous county in the state. It's now 4th. In 1980, we had a higher median family income than Washington County. And today, Washington County's $80,000 a year, and the median net worth is $800,000, just under $1 million in Washington County. Pretty amazing. Census-wise, this is what it tells us right now. We don't have to worry about new families because, frankly, the age group of 5 to 17 has shrunk since 2000. If you look at 2010 to 2000 to 2010, it's negative 7%, that 5 to 17. So the kids, it's been shrinking. It's not growing. The fastest growing fastest growing demographics, 65 plus. That number was 23%. That's who is moving into Oregon, and that's who's moving into Lane County specific. This isn't the state of Oregon numbers. This is Lane County specific. That's who's moving here. That's who's moving here. And when we were getting some of the updates on especially demographics on states, whether in the West Coast mountain region, I didn't even realize this. We found out Utah's the youngest state in the country. Median age 29. Idaho's about 34. And we are 38. We're almost 40. And so that's your housing mix. I mean, we want to compete for all these high-tech jobs and this and that, but I got to tell you, it's going to be tough. It's going to be really rough. You're talking about just trying to hire employees coming to work for local government, the housing issue. I was talking to folks who, in the HVAC industry, they had somebody come in here ready to go to work here and decided to go back to where they were from because at $75,000 a year, they couldn't find a house. I mean, really? So it's kind of insane. So those are your demographics. So you have to meet the housing needs overall for those who are 65 and over who are decided to move here. Oregon's vastly becoming a retirement state. unless you go to the high-tech area up in the metro area, which is a little bit different. And it's challenging. I mean, you go to Central Oregon today, it used to be California, it's now Washington. Folks from the state of Washington are moving into Eagle Crest and they're buying second homes. That's their resort homes. So they're buying second homes. It was California, it's now Seattle. And that's why the housing boom is going on like you see today. It's not because they have this incredible job market. That's not it at all. The job market is construction. And that's the best job market right there in the Central Oregon area, if you want to be paid well. Other than that, it really is about service and making sure that those who want their second homes, by the way, those second homes, they're 3,000 and 4,000 square foot second homes on the golf course, so they're not cheap either. But it's Washington now, Seattle area, where a decade ago was Southern California and the Bay Area. So it's changed dramatically. But those are the housing mixes, and that's what you have to really adapt for. And it kind of breaks my heart to see that 5 to 17 age is negative 7%. So it's not growing at all. It's going backwards compared to what it was. So anyway, those are my comments just to talk about the population piece. But I'm really, from my perspective, it really is about you guys make the decisions. But I did have one last question, and that was on the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee. So you said it would be appointed by the city manager, is that correct? Yes. And the mix of that is going to be, it won't be just from like government employees, you're going to have a mix like business, community, government, so on and so forth?
Right, it's no government employees.
No government employees, okay.
No, we are, in the draft bylaws, it includes Eugene Planning Commissioner, Sustainability Commissioner, and City Council member. We're encouraging a County Planning Commissioner to participate if they wish. And we're also looking at city and nearby county residents. We are also looking for a range of interests and backgrounds. Some folks we expect will represent stakeholder groups, and others will represent themselves and the interests of residents. But we're looking for a mix of geographies and demographics and background.
And it's appointed by the city manager?
Correct.
And not the city council?
Correct.
That's a good thing. Thank you.
Hey.
You're not there anymore.
We are vastly beyond our time estimate on this, so I appreciate your patience.
Thank you very much.
And I just want to say I really, look forward to the process, really support the idea of having an urban reserve planning process. I think it's important. I may send you some email comments about the Technical Advisory Committee later, because as I quickly look over it, I'm not seeing somebody that's familiar with actually putting subdivision streets in on a regular basis. And I think when you guys are looking, sometimes we need to think about how difficult it is to actually put in the street infrastructure, as well as not just stormwater, not just water and sewer. We need to think about just that whole idea of how you lay out a subdivision efficiently and whether you're going to actually get density in an area based on topography, which I think is something that was one of my criticisms of the current land inventory. Was I don't think topography was taken into account at a high enough degree. So getting somebody maybe that's experienced in doing that may be helpful. Thanks. I know it's not considered a municipal service, but it's part of what costs to put in housing. So any other comments from the board? Did you get direction you need from us? Did we miss something we were supposed to cover? Because we didn't talk about the public participation at all, hardly.
Well, you talked about the timeline and how the work is going to flow.
Not getting bogged down. I heard that pretty clearly.
If you don't have anything specific regarding public participation beyond that, that is fine. We will consider that your blessing and move
And working
forward.
together, that's the key is.
I knew that was one of the reasons why you were coming to us. That's why I brought it up.
Correct.
So, well, great. Well, thank you for coming today. We appreciate your time and the joint work we're doing with the city on this. Really important work, though. As you can see, there's a lot of interest. That's why we went 20 minutes over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate the time.
So with that, we are going to move on to the fifth reading and deliberations for Ordinance 1802 in the matter of amending Lane Code Chapter 14 to add, revise, delete definitions and provisions to modernize and update the entire chapter and amend Lane Code Chapters 10, 13, and 16 to update references, definitions, and provisions for consistency with Lane Code Chapter 14 and adopting severability clause, file number 509 PA 1605492. And we have Amber Bell, Lydia, and Andy here. And I don't know who's going to start us off. Amber.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Today we bring before you Ordinance 1802. That's the Chapter 14 Code Modernization Project for a fifth reading and recommended adoption. Since the fourth reading, staff have made the additional revisions that were directed by the board on May 22nd to the revocation or suspension of a decision made in error language and also to the appeal provisions. And so that's reflected in the draft before you. During the open record period, or reopen record period rather, from May 22nd to May 29th at 4 p.m., we did receive one public comment from Mr. Close, and that's been included and distributed to the board in your packet. Comments from Mr. Close propose that appeal submittals should be limited to parties of record. The current draft states that type 2 decisions may be appealed by any person. Staff have reviewed the comments and taken those into consideration and also looked back at ORS Chapter 215 that specifies who may appeal a land use decision. And we do have some recommended additional revisions that we've distributed to the board that we believe are actually more consistent with state law. And so we could remove, if the board so directs in their motion today, the provision that says that any person may appeal a type 2 decision and actually combine the provisions for, or the who may appeal a type 2 or type 3 decision to state that an appeal may be made by any party. That's defined in the draft Chapter 14 definition section, or a person who is entitled to written notice under Chapter 14, or any person who is adversely affected or aggrieved by the application. So those last two are specified by state law. If the board would like to make these additional revisions, you could include that in your motion today. Comments have also been raised throughout the process concerning the revocation or suspension of a decision made in error. That is provided, the current version of Lane Code Chapter 14 does include the suspension or revocation of a decision made in error provision. We have added, per the board's direction, some limitations around that provision, and we believe that those limitations do address some of the current concerns, comments concerning this provision that we've received. And so for that reason, staff recommend approval with the recommended additional revisions to the appeals section, and we are available to answer any questions that you may have.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Sorensen.
I just want to mention that I noticed there was a comment in the record from Mr. Sean Malone. As I've done several other times, I just want to make note that Mr. Malone is a lawyer in private practice, and occasionally, and in a part-time way, I have a private practice, and Mr. Malone and I are working together on a case. So I don't know if this rises to a conflict of interest or a potential conflict of interest or just something that should be disclosed, that I do have that. I don't have any conflict as it applies to his client, who he's written on behalf of. And so I'll be participating in this, but I just want to get that on the record. And I'll ask Mr. Clark if there's anything additionally I need to say about this. This is a legislative matter anyway, isn't it?
Right, correct. Yeah, given that, I think it's fine just to acknowledge the
Okay,
relationship.
good, thank you.
So questions for staff? So I really appreciate the new language on party versus person. I think that's much clearer, and I would encourage whoever makes the motion to include that, because I think it's a good revision. It was a concern of mine. I'm trying to make sure I understand what was proposed on revocation, because I'm getting confused with some of the, we've gone back and forth with language. So I was trying to find, in the new material on page 4, basically of 100, I think it's in the staff memo, there's a portion where you're talking about that section. And there's that language is highlighted in red. Is that what's currently being proposed, or was that what was being proposed by Mr. Close in his letter? And then there's something else that was the final that you're asking us to adopt, because I want to make sure I'm reading the exact language on that.
May I ask, is what you're looking at on page 39 of 42, attachment 2?
Well, I'm looking under the new materials for the board, under that section, and you've got a memo to the board, which is June 4th. And at the 4th page of that memo, it gets into discussing LC 140908.
So that is the additional language that was added to the draft before you per the board's direction, which was based on the Planning Commission review. So that is the additional limitations that I was referring to. And so, putting some sideboards around where a decision can be revoked or suspended where the decision was made in error. And so that is in the current draft presented. Previously, it had just stated the decision issued was based on an error. And so the red language is the additional language.
Okay, I want to make that clear, because what I remember talking about in the last reading was limiting the time period to the length of appeal. And this talks about the approval period is still valid, which is a different time period. I mean, the approval period for a land use decision can be quite lengthy versus, and is that when you extend an approval, there's some things that we do year by year, forest dwellings or something like that. Does that mean that revocation can happen anytime? That's my thought was, once you're past the initial appeal period, that basically tells a person they can go with a land use decision and start investing capital improvements on that, because once they've gotten past appeals with an approved land use decision, there's a good chance they're starting to invest capital. And that's where, why I was talking about end of appeal period, where this talks about approval period, which is not the same thing. So I want to make sure, because I would like, if this is what language is in what we have in the reading, I'm going to propose that we change that language as we read it today, so that we may end up in the 6th reading, which I hate to do, but I have a real concern with that, because my concern with this whole revocation there, one, it's happened 3 times in how many years, I think?
Well, twice.
Twice, okay.
Twice.
Yeah, in like 30 years or something like that. So it's not something that happens often, but what I'm concerned about is it's opening a door for folks to go back and look for every error we've ever made, as long as there's an approval still valid, come in and try and prove the county made an error and get people's land use decisions overturned based on an error outside of the appeal process. Somebody presents factual data that says, county, you made an error, and then maybe even takes us to court over that, and we've had parties come to us and say, I know of one particular place where we had a party point out to us that a Measure 49 right was not sold with a piece of property, and we had to reverse a decision. But of course, fortunately, that happened within the appeal period, and no one had started putting sticks, or bricks in the ground, so to speak. So it was really fortunate no one had made an investment. So that's what I'm concerned about is if we talk about just over while the approval is still valid, it opens the door for people to do search and destroy work and go through and really harm a bunch of people's investments based on a decision. We gave them an appeal that was period that ended, and they had an approval. So I would like to restrict that even further.
And you do know that, see, so is there the language about prior to the expenditure of any substantial financial investment?
I mean, I'll comment quickly while you guys look at it, but I mean, you're right. The language here isn't limited, the time period isn't limited to the time period of the appeal, which is fairly short under the county code system. It has some of the sidebars that you were talking about built into the new language being what you read today, not what is on the paper slip you just got. But the conditions of approval, prior to finalizing those is when the revocation could happen, and also prior to the expenditure of funds, of substantial funds. And so, yeah, it's not the appeal period, but there are some of those sidebars built into it to limit the exercise of that authority. In addition, the one-page paper that Ms. Bell gave you today also has an additional one, which means that is up for discussion and inclusion if you want, which has to do with the subject property remaining within the ownership of the person who initially got it. Once it's sold to somebody else, then that revocation period would terminate.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we have.
No, sorry, thought you had those
we
already.
didn't have in front of us. I was like, I don't see that. I'm flipping Amber's paper back and forth.
So that also could be something that would be included in the motion if the board wants to add that today, and then that would keep us from having to do a sixth reading. But I appreciate Mr. Clark's clarification that we do have those additional sideboards for the revocation in case of an error.
Yeah, I appreciate because one of the things that happens a lot of times is somebody will go through, getting a template dwelling approved or something like that. It increases the value of a piece of property, and then they put it on the market and sell it with that right. And at that point, that person's bought it. It may not be that they put any sticks in the ground or anything like that, but the value of the property at sale included that, that potential right. So the value of the property purchase actually paid for that.
I think a circumstance, though, that would lean toward the proposed language rather than just the appeal period would be a legal lot verification decision, for example, that's followed up with a development application. If it's found out during the development application that a mistake was made, there's still time to fix it as long as nobody's ox is severely gored, shall we say. That is before someone's really stands to lose as a result of that mistake.
Yeah, and I guess that'll get into what's the substantial financial investment, whether some of that, it says in the physical development of the property, having been in the land use arena for a while, there's a lot of intellectual development of a property that goes on, from, legal lot verification to maybe future subdivision. You can spend a lot on attorneys and lawyers and engineers in that meantime. That doesn't put a stick in the ground or, pave a road, but it's still a substantial investment in the property that's going on based on that legal lot verification decision. So that's the one thing I'm a little concerned about is, what vests you? At what point, when you talk about physical development, then you're talking about having to actually go out and do something on the ground. I've seen developers spend $100,000 before they even turn their first, shovel on a rural development. So, in attorneys and planners and engineers, so I'm kind of, it still gets to that. They won't start, no real good developer will start spending that kind of money till their appeal period's ended, because at that point, they think they've got a decision they can spend money on. So that's kind of, we're back to appeal period instead of land use approval. So I'll look to the rest of the board to see what their comfort level is with the revocation language. I really appreciate the language you brought forward on parties, so I think that resolves the issue I had on that, because persons is not well defined in statute, parties is.
If I may, on the item that I just distributed, that's an alternative that you could consider for an additional sideboard for the revocation or suspension of a decision made in error. So that states, for a final land use decision, the subject property has not been conveyed to a new owner. We, considered some additional alternatives for this language. This is one concept. After reviewing Mr. Close's comments that we've drafted up and recommend.
Yeah, and then of course we've got some subjective language in there. Substantial is subjective and not objective.
In terms of the investment
Yeah.
piece, one of the things that, and I don't know that we can get around, unless the board really wants to think of a dollar amount, which I think is dangerous in a lot of ways. But one of the things that,
A lot, it's $10,000 might be a substantial investment. On a 100-lot subdivision, 10,000 is nothing.
right. But to address the concern that you raised before in terms of the intellectual investment, one thing that the board could consider is adding in front of the term physical, so adding planning, design, or in the physical development of the property, that would capture some of those things as well. So the sentence would read, prior to the expenditure of a substantial financial investment in the planning, design, or physical development of the property. So again, just something for the board's consideration here in their deliberations.
Thank you, that makes a lot of sense. And then I guess I look to Andy a little bit. If we choose to alter the proposed code by these two amendments, or anything similar to these two amendments that have been brought forward by staff today, the 1480 change and then this one in 1490, is that going to put us to another reading?
As long as you read the changes verbatim into the record, and then that version of the code is part of the reading that is moved for today, you should be okay with just one more reading.
Just one more, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's it. But we have to read the exact language today. But either way, if we go, unless we adopt without any of these changes today, we're still at a sixth reading.
Yeah, and we've gone back and forth a little bit about that, but as I think about it now, yeah, I think we'd have to come back for another one, because this is the first time this language is introduced, and it is substantive in nature in my estimation, so I think you'd have to do another one.
Yeah. That was what I was thinking. I just want to make sure that as the board considers this, and if whoever makes the motion decides to include these changes, the motion would, if it has the changes in it, the motion will be to approve the fifth reading and setting the sixth reading. If folks are comfortable without those changes and want to make a motion as is, then we could move to adopt today. So that just process-wise, that's where we are. So any discussion from other members of the board or questions about those changes? Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I appreciate the work that has gone in on the changes in I will say the revocation one, I wasn't looking at that quite as closely as the appeal. So the appeal language I am comfortable with, and I appreciate that. But then as I was listening to Chair Bozovich talk about the revocation piece, question I have is that on Chapter 14, I mean, this is one of those chapters that I would hope that the planning staff and planning commission would be looking at this on I'm not going to say, every month, of course, but maybe on an annual basis, just to see where we are, because I think it would be worth the effort. And the reason why I bring this up, think about this for a minute. This whole issue that was brought up by the state and the Building Codes Division, talk about opening a Pandora's box. I mean, that really what they were proposing, Chair Bozovich talked about that, and I think he was correct. That all of a sudden you're making changes, and then what does that do to other, previous work that was already approved years ago, and all of a sudden they're coming back and making these changes now? I mean, literally that would have been just a minefield for the land use legalese to be looking at that for forever. So I think any time that you can add specific language on some of these areas, I think is probably worth it. And that's why I really wasn't paying as close attention to the revocation until I was just listening to Jay talk about it. And all of a sudden it kind of opened my thoughts and thought, wow, it's probably worth the effort for staff and the planning commission to look at this kind of annually to see where we are in Chapter 14, because I think things just continue to change here. And so I think it'd be worth that effort. But the language that's added in revocation right now, I'm okay with that. I'm really okay with the appeals. I appreciate that. That was good. That addition satisfied me, and so that was great. So I appreciate that. The revocation, because this really does affect. It's going to affect West Lane and East Lane a lot more than the Springfield District, we'll put it that way. I've got a little bit of rural area in the Springfield District, but overall, this is really going to affect where Gary and Jay sit. And frankly, I guess I'm going to be looking at the two of them, and if they're uncomfortable, if they want to add some additional language, or the case may be, I don't know. We're going to have to go to another reading anyway. So I'm looking at Chair Bozovich. It sounded like to me you weren't quite that comfortable with it, or are you?
So the appeals language that was brought forward today,
yeah,
I'm perfectly comfortable with.
Yep.
The language on revocation that was brought forward today, I think really helps out a lot with the addition in that one section CC to say financial investment in the planning, design, or physical development of the property. I think that kind of makes me feel a lot more comfortable, because there's investment that happens in a property outside of physical investment, and then that kind of makes me comfortable there. And adding the transfer of the property conveyed to a new owner. So with that one little change to the proposed language staff brought us forward, I'd be comfortable with this being the reading today, and then we hopefully get to adoption in the next reading.
Okay, good.
Which then my question for you, for whoever might make the motion, would the next reading have to be 2 weeks out, because we have to have 13 days for an ordinance?
Correct.
So,
and I think before you do a motion,
yeah, I think we're down 2 weeks, so it's going to have to be 3.
and before you actually have a motion, it may be appropriate to read in the new language or whatever you want to add to it. So,
or would that be read in as part of the motion?
Either way, yeah.
So it'll have to be the 10th.
I think best as part of the motion, yeah. But either you can do it or the motion.
If you want, I can do it now, so it might make it easier for the person reading the motion. So today's reading, includes what was publicized on the website since last Thursday, I guess, or Wednesday, whenever it went live on the website, with 2 additional changes to 2 sections in 14.080 appeals under 1A. who may appeal. We're adding language that says appeals may be made by, and we're deleting the language under item 1 and 2 that speaks to type 2 and for other decisions, and combining those as to one group of people that can make an appeal for any of those decisions as being small Roman numeral 1, any party, small Roman 2, any person who is entitled to written notice under LC 14060, or small Roman numeral 3, any person who is adversely affected or aggrieved by the application. And then under the other change we're proposing is under section 090, I'm going to get the reference correct, 8A, small Roman numeral 5, we are striking the word "and" from the end of BB, labeling the next section CC, and adding 2 words into that so it reads, prior to the expenditure of substantial financial investment in the planning, design, or physical development of the property, adding the word "and" at the end of that, adding a new section DD that says, for a final land use decision, the subject property has not been conveyed to a new owner. Satisfies the reading of the revised language for today, and I will now entertain a motion to approve that reading and set a 6th reading. Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'd like to move the 5th reading, setting the 6th reading and deliberations Ordinance 1802, in the matter of amending Land Code Chapter 14 to add, revise, and delete definitions and provisions to modernize and update the entire chapter, and amending Land Code Chapters 10, 13, and 16 to update references, definitions, and provisions for consistency with Land Code Chapter 14, and adopting a severability clause with the added language as expressed into the record by the chair, and setting this, setting the reading for, I believe, July 10th and 1:30. Do we need to do 1:30 or just July 10th?
Just July 10th.
Okay, setting for July 10th.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second. So it's been moved by Commissioner Lycan, seconded by Commissioner Williams. Any discussion to the motion? Commissioner Lycan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to say thank you. I mean, this has been a pretty long process, but frankly, I think it's a process that's been needed. And I really want to say thank you for the work you've done. And really, as we have gathered especially the written comments, you really took that to heart. And I just want to say, job well done. It's really important, I think, to listen to those who are being directly affected by anything done in land use. And it's got a little bit of the Springfield way to it, so I just thought I'd throw that out there. But I just wanted to say, job well done on this. I know we have the final deliberations on July 10th. We're not adopting today, but I got to tell you, it's been a lot of work, and I just want to say congratulations and job well done.
Any other discussion to the motion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you on the 10th.
Thank you.
And we are going to recess briefly and reassemble in the Board of Commissioners conference room to continue our meeting. So please be prompt because we're running way behind. Back to order for our regular board meeting, Tuesday, June 19th, 2018. And we are moving on to our human resources items, Order 1806-1912 and Order 1806-1913. Both of these orders pertain to the local chapters of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And I believe Commissioner Farr would like to make a statement and before we get into these.
Thank you. Due to a conflict of interest, my son works for Lane County as a member of ASME and also as a shop steward representing both of these units. I will be recusing from this discussion.
Thank you, Commissioner Farr. You are recused and excused from this discussion. And now we will move on to the matter of approving compensation changes for the Lane County American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees for Local 2831 General Unit and Local 2831 Nurses Unit. And I'm going to turn this over to Alana and let you all, oh, go ahead.
Yes.
Darcy.
Thank you, Chair Bozovich. Commissioners, good afternoon. Basically, we're here today as a follow-up to the work session that was held with you last Thursday on the topic that you've already cited. You asked staff to go back and do some research regarding recruitment and retention in specific classifications tied to ASME, as well as have some work done regarding cost and potential budget impacts to help inform the decisions you're being asked to make today with respect to the board orders that are attached in your packet. So at this time, Darcy Dillon, Human Resources Analyst, is going to take the lead. I'd also like to just note that Andy Friedman is in the audience today. He joined us last week and was at the table for the work session, and he is also here today. So Darcy, if you could maybe just do a 1-minute overview so that those that are joining today that didn't see last week, you could put some context to this before you walk through the information.
Sure. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Go ahead, Jake.
I think before you start walking through information, I think Andy wanted to have a moment to address the board too. So if you want to give your introduction, and then we'll get to Andy.
Do you want
Let Darcy set some context here for the folks watching, and we'll get to you.
Okay. So last Wednesday, we presented you the panel results of the compensation review that we did for the ASME classifications. And you guys have that information in your packet, but I'm going to go ahead and hand it out to you so you can look at it a little bit more easier than we did last week. And we did go through and look at retention and recruitment and have some information to present to you today. And I'm going to go ahead and hand out my attachment, and then Andy can go ahead and make a couple of statements.
Great. Andy, if you wouldn't mind sitting over by Andrea, because the mic isn't down on that end.
Sure.
I want to make sure you get picked up by our microphones.
Okay.
So, welcome, Andy.
Thanks. So after last week's work session, I took a little time to go back and look at some of the issues that you'd raised and look a little bit more deeply at some of the detail of what we'd put together as a panel over the last few months. And we did spend a lot of time in last week's work session looking at the high-end compensation, and I just thought it was also important to note, while the county did a fair amount of analysis as well at the low end, and at the low end of total compensation, the numbers are, I think, even more strongly supportive of significant range adjustments. And so I think it makes sense as you're looking through those numbers, from our perspective as a panel, we had a majority opinion in all 9 of these cases related to these range adjustments and had agreement. But I think that the low end analysis further supports those positions. The second point I wanted to make was that in a number of these places where we didn't have consensus, the reason we didn't have consensus was that there was agreement between the panel, there was agreement between the third party and the county. And the union's position was for additional compensation even beyond the range adjustments that the panel agreed to. But I think, from our perspective, we don't think it makes sense to argue further than what the panel agreed to, because our perspective is that the panel process is something that we agreed to and feel strongly that it is something that allowed us to really have an opportunity to dig deep into the numbers and to get to the point where we could work collaboratively to try to figure out, really looking at the data itself away from bargaining, what was fair compensation. And so we support the panel recommendations as they're presented to you. And then the third point I wanted to make was just related to one of the specific classifications, the senior CHA, or the community health analyst, everyone seems to refer to it as the CHAs. So we did not have agreement in that case on which comparators to use. We did not, during the panel process, during the meetings process, we didn't actually have any agreed comparators on that. And you see that in the documents that were presented to you last week. But the union did have two comparators that we felt were useful in making those comparisons, and we did present those to the panel members. We did not have agreement on that, but from our perspective, those further support the conclusions that the panel drew. So even though it looks like there are no comparators for that title, and we talked about the degree to which this work is really fairly unique, that the work done at this level in Lane County is not really done by this level of employee to this degree, to this depth in other counties. But I thought it was important to at least mention that fact. And then I think you're going to talk about some of the data that they'd asked about last week, but that was all that I had.
Great. I appreciate that, Andy.
Thank you.
Thanks for your input.
Okay. Chair Bozovich, Commissioners, so again, we collected recruitment and retention information on the 9 classifications that were where the panel did not have consensus in the voting, 100% consensus in our decision of what we wanted to increase the classifications by. Therefore, that's what we focused our research on in the last week. So the information that I gave you today includes attachment 9 from your packet, which is that recommended increases again, so you had them and could have them in front of you. And then we also included attachment 10, which is the recruitment statistics, and this is for specifically these 9 classifications, and that's attachment 10. And what we found was that we looked at years 2016 full year, 2017 full year, and 2018 year to date. And you'll see reading across this attachment, we have the number of postings, the number of hires, and the number of failed searches for each of those years. And then the very last column is the number of declined offers for the entire span of 2016 through year to date. And we had only in 2016 for the community health analyst senior, we had 3 failed searches. And so therefore we had 4 postings, which resulted in 1 hire. And the notes that I have on the side are that the failed searches were from, we had candidates, we interviewed them, none were selected, or the candidates didn't get past the scoring process, and that's usually because they didn't meet minimum qualifications or something of that nature. For the entire span of time that we looked at, we had no declined offers. And so I don't want to conclude anything for you, but the numbers look pretty good as far as supporting that we don't have recruiting issues for these particular classifications. don't know if you guys have any questions.
Any questions on that table before we move on to the next information?
Okay.
Go ahead, Darcy.
And then the last attachment, attachment 11, are the turnover statistics for the 9 classifications, but it also includes the overall Lane County turnover rate, so you could see that. We have that for 16 and 17. That's that first chart. And so we're saying that the turnover rate for 16 was 11%, 17 it was 15%, and year-to-date we're at 4%.
How many, was that through the month of May or through?
That was through the actual day that we ran it, which was June 14th.
Wow. Doing pretty well this year.
Yes, when I took a look at what the turnover rate is through the Bureau of Labor Statistics for government and local government and state, it runs on an annual basis. For 17, it was 17%, and for 16, it was 17.2, and it's around 1.4 to 1.5% each month. So we're probably right with that trend. The next couple of, or all the rest of the tables are the positions that actually had turnover. So not all of the positions had turnover, and so you're going to see some of them have 0. So starting with the program services coordinator, you'll see that we had retirements, and we had someone who reported they went to other positions. And what happens is when somebody separates with the county, we try to find out why they're separating, but sometimes all we know is that they've resigned. And so for, if they retired, we know it's a retirement. If it's another position, we don't know if that was due to compensation or if it was due to, it could be a combination, they relocated for a new position. We don't know if they left to go fulfill what they went to school for or their passion or whatever. I can tell you anecdotally, because I do exit interviews for the county, that it's all over the place sometimes, and they'll say, I'm going to another position, but they don't necessarily tell you why. We've got a couple of relocations, I believe, and then several of the positions that we were looking at had no turnover. The assistant veterans coordinator had no turnover. The expanded practice dental hygienists, both levels had no turnover, and the medical assistants ones had no turnover. And I can tell you then on an aggregate basis that there were 11 actions over this period of time that we looked at, 11 separations for this group of jobs, and 5 of them were retirements. So that's, people retire for various reasons, whether it's economic or not, it's hard to say. And so that's pretty much the trend that a lot of employers are seeing right now is the retirements of the baby boomers. So what we're seeing is not, I would say is not abnormal.
Steve?
I think this information is really helpful. I seem to be getting this question a lot lately as we go around and have conversations with employees. It's a question that's come up in at least half of the 5 or 6 meetings that I've had with employees. What is the county doing about recruitment and retention? And it's a fair question. And I haven't had access to this information, so it's really helpful, I think, to know what the actual numbers are. You first have to conclude that we have an issue with recruitment and retention. I think it is important to acknowledge that depending on the industry that you're in, anywhere between 10 to 20% turnover is considered a healthy attrition rate. If you have significantly less than 10%, you could be deemed as stagnant. If you have significantly higher than 20%, again, depending on the industry that you're in, you probably have to ask some questions about what is the heavy turnover like. For example, in hospitality, it may not be unusual to expect a 30% turnover rate, whereas in utilities, it may not be unusual to expect a less than 10% turnover rate. So it also should be expected that the public sector, during really low, a strong economy and a low unemployment scenario, which we're in right now, tends to have a higher turnover. So you see that on the national data, when you look at the average of state and local governments, that it's increased from 14% turnover in 2008 to 17% turnover last year. In Lane County, if you look, I don't know that you provided this information, but I think in 2012, we had a 19% turnover in Lane County, and then it dropped down to 11 to 12%, and ticked up a little bit last year, in large part because of retirement. So
2012 was the big budget cut.
2012 was a big budget cut, so you had a number of layoffs as well as people retiring and just leaving because of concerns over financial constraints. And then we were hovering around the 11, 12% for a few years, and then we ticked up to 11% in 2016, 15% in 2017. We're on pace, depending on at the end of the year if we have a large number of retirements, we're on pace to be lower than the last several years. So I just want to set that as context that, in my opinion, it should not be a goal to have 0% turnover. I think we have to expect that we do have an aging workforce. We have several hundred employees that are eligible for retirement at this point, or eligible within the next few years. And so it should be expected that, and it also should be expected that people are going to move through the organization for one reason or another, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We should keep a watch on whether or not our numbers drop too low or spike too high, significantly above sort of where we've trended over the last several years, and then ask questions as to why that is. What this doesn't tell you is there are some pockets of areas where we do have challenges, in particular with recruitment, and you wouldn't be surprised, I think, to know that those tend to be in the healthcare arena. Highly competitive, a lot of competition nationally for healthcare provider positions, nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, primary care physicians, psychiatrists, mental health specialists are all typically difficult to recruit for anywhere you look in the country, and certainly statewide here. And so there are certain areas where we generally have more of a challenge. It's also frankly a real challenge in the management realm. And that's pretty typical because you have a smaller pool of individuals that are qualified for a number of those types of positions that require higher education and experience levels. So anyways, I just wanted to provide that kind of broader context to what we should be thinking about when we look at turnover and attrition. I think the numbers point to the fact that we're in a really pretty solid and stable position as it relates to the turnover of our workforce.
Any questions on the recruitment, retention, and turnover? So I think we have one other item to cover on the budget.
So,
Or
Christine, Cindy is behind us, and I can stay, and she can.
thank you for getting close to a microphone.
All right, that's good. Thank you. So I have reached out to specifically Health and Human Services and then looked at some of the other data on the ability to pay question and the budget question. I think I have some numbers for you, and then we have some additional information. So I think Steve and I are going to kind of tag team this back and forth to give you the whole picture of program impacts or other comments. So in Health and Human Services, and I didn't just look at the 9, so I have just a little bit of comment on the nurses from Health and Human Services, but then some of those specific positions. So in general, I guess the nurses, of course, are going to cross the community health centers, and public health is going to be the big piece that's going to be general fund. That's where I'm also focusing, is the general fund in particular. So the community health clinics, they're currently structurally balanced. They do believe they're in a position to pay the proposed compensation changes at this point without any service reductions. And Steve, I don't know if you want to make any comment about the clinics in general. Do you want to wait?
Yeah, and so I just, would say that, of course, we've had conversations about the potential and the need to open an additional clinic. We focused particularly on rural Lane County. We know that access to primary care, dental health, mental health services in the rural areas is a challenge. And so we've been looking in the South Lane County area, particularly around Cottage Grove, and partnering with the school district there, LCC, Peace Health, and others to look at that. That's still something on the table, but I want to put that out there. We still have a need for increasing access to care. And so that's not at all to say that your action to approve or make modifications here would not allow that to happen, but know that there's still a need to address access issues. And then, of course, I'll just make a general statement. I think we've been so far pleasantly surprised, pleasantly pleased. We've been pleased with the fact that we have not seen the concerns about significant changes in policy at the federal level and the potential impact on that on funding for Lane County. Of course, we also know that we have a federally qualified health center designation, which puts us in a better position because it allows us to achieve higher reimbursement rates than if we were not an FQHC. So those are all good things. I just would generally put out there that, as a cautionary note, we're always monitoring the potential for changes at the federal level and at the state level and how that potentially could impact funding for the clinics. The other thing just to note and to keep in the back of your mind is the CCO structure and who our CCO is. There's a process now that the state is going through to identify, and I think they're doing an RFP type process and evaluation of that, and we will have a role in that process, but of course there's always a possibility that we could have a different CCO than our current CCO, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it significantly changes things. Again, we want to put these things on the table so that you're understanding the potential for external threats that we don't necessarily control.
Okay, in some other areas, public health in particular, the pieces that were highlighted to me from the department were in the maternal and child health program. I think that's a combination of both maybe some nurses and general unit employees there. That would have an impact of about $42,000 over the 2 years. They would look to fee revenue to cover that. There are some other places such as communicable disease that rely on general fund. There's places in public health that rely on general fund. So that in particular is a community health analyst positions that were highlighted to me that would require additional general fund of about $15,000 over the 2 years. And again, maybe I should just make one comment on these projections. These are based on current employees. I mean, that's the data that we have when we're going and projecting these. So if you have a change in employees, that of course will change these projections, but it's based on who's in the position right now. Veterans and Human Services Division, who are also dependent on general fund for the positions impacted, would see about $16,000 over the 2 years. And then Youth Services, again, predominantly supported by general fund. That is in the nurses unit where they have positions out there. That's about $15,500 over the 2 years. Then to get in just some other H&HS programs, the program services coordinators, those are some of the 9. I think we have just 1.8 FTE there, so 2 employees. They are located in Health and Human Services Administration, so they do contracts, so that is going to impact. They charge out their costs from admin the same way we do countywide out to all of their Health and Human Services programs, so that would be spread that way. It's about $16,500 over the 2-year period. And then other H&HS programs, what was highlighted, community health analysts 1, 2, and seniors in particular rely on some Trillium grant money and state grant funds in a gambling program. And so then there's some comments, I think, on the program, Steve, if you want to share the impacts there.
So the department had a plan to add a half FTE community service worker for suicide prevention. This is the one, as we could determine, it's the one potential or likely service impact that they would not be able to fill that half FTE position because of it's grant funded. So there's really nowhere else for those that position, that half FTE to be funded. So that would have to wait.
So I want to make sure I'm clear. So that's based on the program service coordinator increases affecting that particular grant program?
Community health analysts.
Community health analysts.
Community health analysts are both in public health.
Right.
Which portion of that is funded out of the general fund, and then there, I don't know how many, if you know, Christine, how many positions are funded with grant funds. Trillion grant funds and state grant funds through the Envision program. So that's the area where, because it's grant funded, it's a.
So the increases for the CHAs will take up enough of our budget under the grants to prevent us from being able to hire the half FTE.
Correct.
So that's the only.
To add a half FTE.
Yeah.
So it's
To add, yeah.
it's a service impact. It's not a reduction in an existing service.
Right.
It's an inability.
It's an ad we were thinking of, but we won't be able to, okay.
For suicide.
Then in the area of technology services, district attorney's office, and financial services are the other places we see impact. Technology services, as you've heard from me before, because they bill out to all of the county, that impacts all funds. But specific to the general fund pays about 35% of the TS charges. So if that held, that would be about 18.6 thousand over the 2-year period. District Attorney Office Financial Services is another 38, almost 39,000 over the 2 years. So combined, I know you were writing some numbers down, and some of these were not general fund numbers I gave you, but the general fund impact is estimated at just over 100,000 over the 2-year period. Those are all the numbers, Stephen.
So we're happy to, I think that was everything we're going to present. I'll just make a general comment, a couple of general comments. First, a cautionary note. I'll start with the cautionary note. And the board knows this, but we have an obligation to acknowledge the fact that we have 8 bargaining units now. And we typically, when we go through these processes, we look in isolation. We're negotiating or looking at market and then talking about the financial impacts within that one unit, or in this case, 2 units. It's also, so we're presenting to you today the impacts to the general fund over the course of the general fund, as well as other funds, community health center funds, grant funds, and all those things over the next 2 years. It's important also to remember that we have several other bargaining units that impact the general fund, and one of them we're currently negotiating with the prosecuting attorneys, and the other we'll be negotiating with next year, LCPOA. So just, this is always a moving target. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't consider approval of the recommendations and the information that's been put forward. We have an obligation to share that with you. Again, it's a reason why we're doing everything we can to manage our benefit costs. We want our positions to be as competitive in the market as possible. We've always said that. We want them to have reasonable and fair comparisons that we use, and I think we've landed on that, even though there was some disagreement through the process around what the comparisons would look like. My opinion is the process was a reasonably healthy one. There was disagreement throughout that process, but that's okay. You've asked for a lot of information, been presented a lot of data and information with which to consider these things. So keep in mind that this is a moving target, and every time we approve increases, it will continue to push the expense side where we have very limited ability to continue to increase revenues to match those expenses. But I would say on the other side of this that we agreed to 2 MOUs, and we agreed to a process that we negotiated and felt was a fair and appropriate process. It's not a perfect process. There was some disagreement throughout that, but Commissioner Sorensen last time asked me if I was going to have a recommendation. I will tell you that I can't sit here and say that any of these will have a financial impact that in and of themselves are going to break the budget. As long as you continue to keep in mind that we have a responsibility, fiduciary responsibility to steward the limited resources we have and balance those with the need for services. There's a potential for some service impacts here, but I would say generally speaking, I support the process that we agreed to, and we can support the recommendations put forward, understanding that the board may choose to make some adjustments based on the information that's been presented to you. On the whole, and as a general comment, my feeling is that these, we're doing a lot of work to move forward and with our organization and continue to improve our relationships and our morale and productivity in the organization, and we all hold a great deal of hope and optimism about what the future will be for our organization and for our workforce, and we're excited about the culture that we continue to build, a culture of leadership, and a focus on solutions, a commitment to service, and a drive to connect with others. So I'll end there, and then we're happy to answer any questions you may have.
So any questions about the budget information that was presented, Commissioner
Well, it
Sorensen?
sounds like, and I'm kind of blending the budget information with the recommendation, but it sounds like in general, that the budget will be affected, but it will not be affected to a degree that you are concerned that it would override the process. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. I think it's, the board needs to consider those financial impacts and determine if you're comfortable with all of them. But I and our departments would have come forward and said, this is gonna really, we were not saying this is gonna result in any layoffs directly as a result of this action. You are presented with, a little bit of a service impact in some targeted areas, but generally speaking, yes, we feel that we can manage the financial
And this
impacts.
won't involve any amendment to our budget because it's way under the budget amendment process.
It would
Part of the
it'll still
supplemental.
result in a supplemental. Yeah,
Right.
anytime we change salaries, we'll put that in order
Okay.
to.
Is that
It just
because
won't
we-
require a hearing.
Is that because we want to, as opposed to the budget law requires it?
No, we don't want to end up with a budget violation. Because this is the expenditure side, we do need to increase the budget anytime that we're increasing our
Okay.
expenses, yeah.
Good, well, I would say, that just looking over the pages where there's a difference between the county proposal and the union proposal and the panel proposal, you see obviously a trend where, there's most of the time agreement, a few times one side or the other gets the
Mediators.
gets the mediator to go with them, and in those instances, taken as a whole, they seem to balance out. Now, an example, I guess, would be where there's on the accountant grade 32, that's a fairly typical example where the AFSCME suggests 4 steps, county suggests 2, panel proposal adopts 2. On a more extreme level, community health analyst 2, union proposes 8, county proposes 4, based upon new data, and the panel adopts 4. So each time there's obviously a give and take, and I think for me, as I said earlier in this process, I think the process that the county and the union set up ought to be respected.
So, further, any questions from the board, or we're moving into some discussion maybe? I'd like to maybe, let's, bifurcate this a little bit, and I would suggest maybe we take the nurses first again, because as I look through my larger concerns have to do with where there's general fund impact or grant impact. We do have this overhanging thing with general fund that, property taxes can only increase, at 3% a year on a piece of property, no matter what the market's doing, plus whatever new, value we get in. So it's usually somewhere between 3 and 4.5% on a really good year that our property tax revenue increases. We already have a background increase on this contract of 222 in the COLAs. So, that takes up, part of that 3% is already in that. So as soon as you go past a 1, we're beyond our general fund revenue growth. 1 step increase, 2.5% plus the 2, there's 4.5. So that's why general fund is one of those places where I think about what's the long-term impact and all that. The grant funding is one of those things where we don't have the ability, the grant's the grant. But then, of course, the next time we go for the grant, we can ask for additional monies based on the changes in the expenses. Whether we actually get those, that's a whole nother story. But we have, that's just, government and nonprofits living off of grants has been a change in funding of government that's occurred over the last 20 years that is not, I don't necessarily think is a great change, because it's really difficult to plan personnel around that. And it's, I can't imagine what it'd be like to be a nonprofit director nowadays and trying to think about your budget more than a year out. How does somebody, like Craig Opperman, the head of Looking Glass, try and think about how he's going to maintain his staff more than a year or two when his grant's ended in a year or two? And he doesn't know if he's going to get the next grant and how much it's going to be. If that program is going to be slashed by the federal government or the state, or he might not get that Meyer Memorial Trust grant or whatever else that was supporting those positions. I don't envy that. At least we're not quite as grant dependent, but when I hear there's a grant issue, that raises, so that's why the nurses unit for me is the easiest one to deal with, because that's mostly in the health clinics. There are a few places it does touch general fund, but most of it's either fee generated or whatever, where we're pretty sure there's not going to, there's an ability to pay there. We don't have to worry about that. Secondarily to that, looking at the recruitment and retention data, I didn't see an issue with any of those positions. I didn't see a non-hire. You look at the dental hygienist, 1 posting gets 5 hires. That's a pretty good ratio. But but the interesting thing about that was temp positions, which are now permanent, so that's going to completely change as we get into the next set up. Well, there'll be new data, so that old data might even reflect what's going to happen going forward. I am pleased with our general recruitment and retention data. It actually speaks to we don't have a recruitment and retention issue. Seeing the retirements drop off like that, at least in the first half of this year, one of the things is the legislation's, had a short session this time and we weren't talking about PERS reform like in 17 when they were, and we saw 72 retirements every time. So I would expect that to go back up in 19 when the legislature starts meeting again and starts discussing PERS reform again. That always tends to drive some of the tier 1, tier 2 people into decision-making mode.
Chair, I want to clarify
Sure.
something on the recruitment data that you're looking at. Like for the expanded practice dental hygienist, there were actually 5 positions, but they took care of it with 1 posting.
Right.
So I just want to make sure.
Yeah, that's what I understood. Did I say that incorrectly? I meant 1 posting, 5 hires.
And in those particular positions, they're rehired every year. They were rehired every year, so we had to post and rehired the same people typically into the same
Right.
positions.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to make sure that on that chart where we might have 1 position and multiple hires, there were multiple positions that we were
Right.
recruiting for.
Yeah, and I understood that.
Okay.
But it's kind of like, but you didn't have to go out multiple times for hiring multiple positions. So that
Correct.
it speaks to that we must be somewhere in the market if you only had to post once to hire 5 people.
True.
That's kind of what I was trying to get at there with that comment. So, as I look at the nurses unit and the proposed changes from the panel, there were only a few asterisks in there, and it sounded like there were, like Commissioner Sorensen described, there were times when it went ASME's direction and times when it went the county's direction. But overall, I think we can, I'm willing to, just straight up adopt the panel's recommendations on the nurses unit as is. So that's my input, and I don't know where everybody else is on that, but I think that would be, that's why I wanted to take it first, because I think I've got more to discuss when we get to the general unit. Any thoughts from the rest of the board? So we do have an order that has that the panel's proposal in the order ready for us as 1806-1913. Is there someone that wishes to make a motion? Commissioner Lycan.
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved by Commissioner Lycan, seconded by Commissioner Williams to approve Order 1806-1913 in the matter of approving compensation changes for Lane County American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Local 2831 Nurses Unit. Any discussion to the motion? I'd just like to say thank you very much to all the panel participants. That was a lot of work, and I think we're, resolving this issue, and I appreciate all the work that went behind it. Any other discussion to the motion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes 4-0 with Commissioner Farr excused for this vote. So that gets us to the general unit. And I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about the CHAWS and that particular grant around suicide prevention. We've had a lot of discussion about suicide when we've had our meeting as Board of Health and in general with the board, and the fact that we had to set up a emergency response earlier this year to a cluster of youth suicides. Is that particular grant got are you aware of a time period that grant is out there, or is it a 5-year grant that we're impacting, or is this a year-to-year or 2-year?
And I'm afraid I don't have that information. And they didn't even specify that in particular was a grant. They just said that the impact on the other positions that are grant funded was going to impact the ability to add this 0.5.
Right.
They're going to have to use the resources.
Right. But it was the changes in the
Correct.
CHAWS that are funded by that grant that are eating up the funds available
Correct.
to bring a new position, half FTE on that would deal with suicide prevention.
Correct, right, yeah.
So-
And those were Trillium and a state grant is all of the information that I
Yeah.
have there.
And the CHAWS was the series that I was a little bit concerned about. Internal CHAWS and Program Services Coordinators were the ones I was concerned about, internal equity and some of the issues around that, just to make sure we're keeping proper balance. Really everything else on the general unit that had asterisks on it, I'm okay with, so I'm just kind of focusing in on those two families, because that was kind of where I was looking at, just making sure we're keeping internal equities right, and also those tend to be positions that are in grants. Any other board members have some comments on the general unit before we get?
Well, I just have the same
Mr. Son.
comments on the other one, too. I think the process is good.
Okay. Stick with the panel?
Stick with the panel.
Okay. Any thoughts from anyone else or suggestions for changes from the panel? I'm not seeing any, so I would entertain a motion on the order 1806-1912.
Move approval.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to approve Order 1806-1912, which is to adopt the general unit changes as proposed by the panel. Any discussion to the motion? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes 4-0 with Commissioner Farr excused. Thank you, everybody. So with that, we have to take care of a couple other pieces of board business before we go into exec session. Review of assignments. Mr. Mokahysky, don't think I heard any today, other than a sixth reading coming up on the Chapter 14. Any other business for the board before I read this into executive session?
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Commissioner Farr was excused for the executive session, but I'm not sure he knows we jump back into public session.
Yeah. When I read us into exec session, I was going to send somebody to get him because the first two items in exec session, he'll be here for at least until he has to leave at 4:30. So let me read us into executive session. I'm not expecting us to come back out. So the Board of County Commissioners will meet in executive session to consult with counsel concerning the legal rights and duties of a public body with regard to current litigation or litigation likely to be filed, and to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to carry on labor negotiations. This executive session will be held pursuant to ORS 1926602D and H, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decisions will be made in executive session. We do not expect to come out in the public session. We will probably adjourn from executive session because I'm not foreseeing any decisions that need to be made based on the agenda. So with that, we are in executive session.